So, Sean, what is the gospel?
What is the gospel? Well, just
Yeah.
recently I did a deep dive. I wouldn't say a deep dive, but a deep-ish dive on how to define the gospel and went through the New Testament and looked at every instance where the term gospel was used. And the definition that I came up with, and I would not necessarily put this in stone, but for me, the gospel is what God has done, is doing, and will do to restore us into full maturity and reflecting His image. So it's the good news of what God has done for us, is doing for us, and will do for us to kind of bring us back into fellowship, full fellowship with Himself.
I really like that. Can you elaborate for me those three phases? What he has done, is doing, and will do?
Yeah, I mean the has done part is I think focuses on his actions in the past, whether it was obviously the supreme act of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. That's maybe um, the most obvious and important part of the whole process, I would say. What he is doing is the ongoing work of seeking to reconcile us to himself and
Mm.
bring us into full and restored relationship with him and restored relationship with one another. It involves and it continues to involve, uh, his 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 act of healing us, and that has a vertical but also a horizontal dimension. And the focus, though, is there on what God is doing. We certainly
Mm.
can cooperate with him in that process, but he takes the initiative and we allow him to work in and through us. One of the reasons I brought out this particular aspect um, in my thinking or recognized it is that Jesus talked about, sometimes as followers of Jesus, people go a lot to what Paul says about the gospel, but there's not as much focus on, what Jesus says about the gospel. And so many times, actually not so many times, but a number of times, Jesus talks about the gospel of the kingdom.
Mm.
And so that's maybe a little different emphasis than what Paul talks about. And I think what that is just God's principles of love being made manifest in human experience and human flesh. So the gospel of the kingdom is what God is trying to do in Christ for us to restore us into His image. And then what He will do is, it takes on a whole bunch of different facets, but I think it would include um, his his final and full establishment of His kingdom on
Mm.
earth in the future, in eternity, and that involves, His return. It involves, I would say, and this is maybe a unique aspect that our particular faith community that you and I are a part of might look at, and that is, Paul himself says that God is bringing every work into judgment, and
Mm.
He is judging the secret thoughts of man, and He says this is according to my gospel, and so he mentions like this type of judgment as an aspect of the gospel, and that kind of gave me pause initially when I read that. I said, well, what does this have to do with the gospel? And I
Mm.
think what that has to do, the reason it's good news is because it's basically God's assurance that there will be no performative religion in His eternal kingdom. That we can trust that there won't be hypocrites, I guess you could say, in His eternal kingdom. That any type of religion that is merely a performance,
Mm.
where people make a pretension, where they pretend to be somebody they're not, is not going to be tolerated in God's eternal kingdom. And that may sound harsh or like bad news, but for people who have been damaged by religion, damaged by religious people, damaged by the hypocrisy, the religious abuse that has taken place, I mean, I think that sounds like very good news.
Mm.
And so his eternal kingdom will not, we won't have to stress that his eternal kingdom will include people who have proclaimed him with their lips, but whose lives do not reflect the values of his kingdom.
I think that sounds refreshing
Hmm.
because
Wow.
yeah, when you think of hypocrisy, that's one of the biggest turnoffs of religion. I think
Mm.
we encounter people who have been burnt or had negative experiences. A lot of the time, it's that very reason that they see through people's behaviors and the disingenuousness, the lack of authenticity. People are very perceptive, I believe, and so to
Yeah.
hear that in that space, that hypocrisy, inauthenticity will be gone. Yeah, that sounds refreshing to me.
Yeah, the way I view it is, like you point out, people value and crave transparency and
Mm,
authenticity. And so God is basically, I think, by announcing the good news of this quote unquote judgment, he's announcing that his kingdom is characterized wholly by transparency.
mm,
That we have nothing to hide, and that's the beauty of the gospel as well. And that's where that kind of what he has done for us piece connects
yeah.
with the what he will do piece, is that when we come into the glorious light of his love and we recognize that there is no condemnation, we have nothing to hide, so we can come
Mm,
out into the light. We won't be embarrassed by any little secret, because there's nothing to hide. We've already been forgiven, we've already been
mm,
embraced, we've already been accepted. And so the people who are a part of God's eternal kingdom, they won't, I don't believe, have earned their way into that kingdom, but they are so grounded in the reality of God's forgiving, gracious love that they can just be who they are, because they
yeah.
realize they can be who they are without judgment. And so
Mm,
all of the pretension is just stripped away. And yeah, we can have the assurance that everybody who is living in that eternal kingdom will be who they are. There'll be no secrets, no lies, no hypocrisy. And so that's, yeah, to me, that's a very refreshing message.
I like what you're saying there. I think that's something I've come to learn we can have access to now because when we recognize that our value is intrinsic and that, as
Mm,
you said, there's no condemnation for those who have responded to God's gift. You don't have to pretend to be anything you're not, then you can start expressing who you really are. And so no
mm,
longer are you trying to prove your worth and prove your value. You're living from a position of significance and value. And that's such a
mm,
liberating thing.
mm.
It's a game changer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Even as you say it, I kind of get chills on my up my spine, because that
Yeah.
is so powerful and so beautiful. And it's really, again, it gives people the confidence and security to just be who they are,
Mm,
without fear of exposure. Because, you know, if the God of the universe has already seen every corner and crevice of our lives, why do we have to be afraid of anyone else seeing any corner and crevice? And so I think the implications of that idea are extremely powerful, as I think it's an invitation from God to step into these practices already. Like, let's create spaces and communities that allow for that
mm,
authenticity, that vulnerability, that openness, that exposure, because in so doing, we are kind of getting into the rhythm of and practicing for, if you will, God's eternal kingdom of love.
mm. Uh, I guess to ask the question again, Sean, because I guess it's easy for us to have this conversation because we've both got background in studying the Bible. But how would you answer the question of what is the gospel for someone who's never been in the church, never picked up
Mhm.
a Bible, like they're starting from the base level. What
Mhm.
is the gospel?
Yeah, so not to be difficult, but I would probably need to know more about who this person is
Mm,
and where they're coming from, what their religious background is. I'd probably answer it differently. Again, not to be difficult. Sorry, Josh, but
why is that relevant? Why does it
well,
matter what their background is?
just because we all hear things through our filters of
Mm,
experience, and you might find yourself using an analogy or a word or an explanation that has particular baggage for people depending on where they've come from. So I would honestly, I would answer the question differently if I'm speaking to a Muslim versus a Hindu versus a, you know, pure atheist. So again, I apologize for being difficult, but in general, I mean, the most basic explanation I would give, I don't know that I would change it much from what I already shared, and that is the gospel is the good news of what the God of heaven is trying, has done, is doing,
Mm,
and will continue to do on your behalf to bring you into a fully restored relationship with himself. So yeah, I
mm.
think I would answer it very similarly to how I answered it before.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and I think you see Jesus doing that in his approach, because in John 3 when he meets Nicodemus, he says you've got to be born again. But to the woman at the
Hmm.
well, it's living water, and so he's
Hmm.
contextualizing. It's the same gospel, but meeting the person where they're at. I appreciate what you're saying there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important. A lot of people don't recognize the contextual nature of the kind of gospel program, if you will.
Mm,
Um, One of my favorite authors who shares a last name with you, but spells it a
yeah.
little differently than you do, Leslie Newbegin, he says something basically, and I'm going to butcher what he says, but he basically says the missionary doesn't take the gospel and then try to contextualize it to the person he's trying to explain it to. He already encounters a contextualized gospel in the way that he's accepted it. So
Mm,
it's always contextualization. It's always, I hear it in a certain way that makes sense to me. Even the scriptural writers are contextualizing the gospel. And I don't want to get into the weeds too much. I don't
yeah,
know
yeah.
if this would go over the heads of those who are listening or not, but it's just the more we can recognize that God, and even that's a part of the gospel, I would say, is God's willingness to contextualize and meet us where we are. He's bridging the gap between us and him.
Mm,
Um, he's willing to like come to where we are and to speak in our language, to take on our flesh, and to make it understandable to us is a beautiful picture of the good news of God's willingness to meet us where we are rather than expecting us to kind of find our way to him or to reach up to where he
mm,
is. He comes down to where we are.
yeah. That repeated point that you keep emphasizing there is what God is doing, what God has done, what God will do.
Mm.
And that's like a key idea that's jumping out to me from what you're sharing is the emphasis is on what God's action. He's the initiator.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm,
Yep. Yeah. And the Bible talks about how he is the author, Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith. So he's the
mm,
initiator. He's the one who continues to take, the lead role, and he's the one who'll bring it to completion. Now, does that mean we just like literally just sit back and do nothing? No, it means we respond to his action, and we have a choice whether we want to allow him to complete the gospel work in our lives or not.
mm. I was looking over your book yesterday, the table I long for, and
Hmm.
and there's so many great things that jump out in that book. I really appreciate it. And one thing that jumped out to me yesterday is you mentioned in there that you hadn't always had the experience of the gospel penetrating your heart, and so
Mm.
I guess my understanding of what you're sharing, you had an intellectual grasp of the theory of the gospel, but it was lacking that experience of a heart encounter. And
Mm.
so, yeah, my question was, what prevented you from having a heart encounter earlier, and what
Mm.
led you to go to that deeper level to shift from your head to your heart?
That's a great question. I would say that a lot of it kind of just revolved around or stemmed from this very intentional decision on my wife and my part to uh, sort of be incarnational, to be
mm,
to step outside of our box and our very narrow way of thinking and living as Seventh-day Adventist Christians who basically only spent time with Seventh-day Adventist Christians, um, and to step out into the world of the world beyond our religious community. And that just sort of started this incredible journey of rethinking a lot of my own assumptions and recognizing that for one, the gospel is, I think, in many ways a lot more simple than I had made it out to be. And at the same time, it's a lot more deep than I think I
mm,
understood. So it's both simple and it's deep. And I think it's because it's simple enough for us to be able to latch on to it and to appreciate it, but it's deep enough so that we'll never get bored with it, right? Um, but I think, just the very practical reality was that I didn't necessarily understand the implications of the gospel in the sense that my working theory of it was just theory. It was like, okay, I understand the A's and B's and C's of the gospel, like the alphabet of the gospel, but I didn't necessarily see how it worked out practically in the lives of people for whom it was very meaningful in the sense that, whether it's people who are, in some ways I was I've lived this very privileged religious life. And
mm,
so the gospel was just kind of this, oh, that's nice, that makes sense. But um, when it really, the rubber met the road, it didn't really challenge my thinking that much. It didn't really challenge and I'll use this term, it didn't really challenge my traditions that much. Um, and what was a kind of a light bulb moment for me a few years ago was the fact that, well, the recognition, at least as I understand it, that the gospel, when it breaks in, it seems to always challenge our traditions. And it seems like there's always basically some semblance of this formula where when people start to really grasp the gospel, they say, the gospel liberates me from these traditions that I thought were at one point important. So, you
mm,
know, two very, and I think this is what actually makes the gospel so scandalous and threatening to people. So two examples, Paul, he announces, oh, justification is by faith. And if that was just like all there was to it, I think he probably would have been received with like, okay, that's a nice idea, but it's not really threatening to us. But what Paul does is that he basically says justification by faith, justification is by faith. Therefore, you don't have to be circumcised to be a part of God's people. And that was what was so threatening.
mm,
So it directly confronted these, issues of identity and control and belonging and tradition that his religious community believed in. And so, another example is like Martin Luther, who's a great hero of mine. He basically, when he really had the gospel break in and start to sink in for him, he challenged as a result the practice of what was called indulgences. Like
mm,
basically, because we are justified by the love of Jesus, we don't have to practice indulgences anymore. So to me, it was just like, oh, okay, if the gospel is true, there has to be, I'm sure, things in my life that I believe are necessary for me to be a part of God's people that maybe they aren't. Maybe I have been,
mm,
freed from these things, liberated from them. And so that's when it kind of the light bulb was starting to be turned on, was like, oh, okay, so this has implications for many different things in my life that I one time thought were necessary. And now, because I'm living in the freedom of the gospel, I don't think they are necessary. So that's when it really kind of shifted for me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what were some of the implications for you? You just mentioned that
Yeah,
considering some things that you thought were necessary that perhaps aren't.
yeah. So some people might think, depending on who's listening, some people might think these are really like innocuous, like, oh boy, of course, what took them so long to realize that? Others might be like, whoa, this is crazy. But
Mm,
just simple stuff like, I mean, the easiest example I give, and again, you might be listening to this, or Josh, you might hear this and be like, wow, this guy was really, you know, overly conservative or whatever. But even something as simple as like a wedding ring,
mm,
like for the first, what, 16 or so years of marriage, my wife and I didn't have a wedding ring. And, she'll be the first to tell you, like, this was all my idea. She was fine with getting a wedding ring, blah, blah, blah. And it was just all me. But yeah, after like, I think the gospel broke in for me, I was just like, well, that seems like a silly man-made tradition. If I wear a wedding ring, I don't think I'm gonna be throwing out my standing with God. I
mm,
don't think that makes me a bad person or a bad Christian. I don't think that means my character is being formed into some sort of self-absorbed, prideful person. And so I was just like, why wouldn't I get one? And to me, it's actually like a greater witness to the beauty of matrimony by having one than not having one.
mm,
So that's just one example. I could cite other examples like, I thought, we needed to be traditional in the types of music we allowed, in a worship service or how we dressed when we went, quote unquote, to church.
mm.
Um, or, I could go down the line. I don't think for many listeners, it would probably be anything overly radical. Like, I didn't suddenly think that polygamy was all right because the gospel frees us to be polygamous. Um, but just stuff like that that probably seems to me would be labeled by Jesus as the traditions of man.
Mm. It makes sense. How has it impacted your relationship with God having those realizations?
Oh man, I've shared it this way a number of times, and I think I share it in the book. But um, I I came to a place where I realized, and this was one of the other things that I feel like the gospel freed me when it comes to this, is that I realized that my security doesn't come from being infallibly right, but from being infinitely loved. And
Mm,
so that allows me, I think it gives me a greater um, and more dynamic relationship with Christ because I think before I was often hustling for approval. I was kind of constantly checking in, like to make sure that I was I was on the ins based on my performance and based on my behavior. One of my friends, his name is Nathan Stearman. He had been pastoring here in Maine until a couple of years ago, but he kind of says like when um, before he really understood the gospel, he was kind of always taking just a little bit of like works, so to speak, to just kind of hedge his bets, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, I'm saved by the reality of what God has done in Christ. I'm loved by him because of that. But just to make sure, I'm just going to sneak in a little bit of good performance, and I'm going to keep checking in to make sure I'm performing well. And quite frankly, I don't think you can have a very healthy or robust or functional or peace-filled journey with God if that's what you're doing. Because,
Mm,
when we're constantly kind of checking in to make sure that, our performance is adequate, I mean, that wreaks havoc on any relationship. And so
mm,
it has been my journey with God has been easily the most healthy and vibrant and beautiful and you know dynamic relationship it's ever been since this shift in my thinking. And that's something that gives me reassurance. I still have questions and doubts and concerns that, oh man, maybe I'm an apostate or whatever. And other people have in roundabout ways maybe implied that perhaps I am. Um, and I just say, man, this is all coincided with easily the most active, robust kind of uh, personal life with Jesus that I've ever had. I
Mm.
pray more, I spend more time in scripture, all that sort of thing. So that gives me a little bit of reassurance that maybe I'm not on the road to apostasy, but then again, maybe I am. I don't know. Maybe someone like you can straighten me out and let me know if I am.
I can relate to that struggle that your friend had in that, wanting to hedge your bets. And
Mm-hmm.
when I think about it, I think it really comes down to a failure to trust God, because
Mm.
on the one hand, it's righteousness by faith, and it's all on on the work of what Christ has done on our behalf. But I just
Mm-hmm.
got to add a little bit more just to make sure. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a tendency of human nature to really be drawn into that. And maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
because it's a tendency of human nature to distrust God and trust self. And
Mm. Yeah.
and so as I've grown in my own understanding of gospel, it's recognizing it's 100% by grace, accessed 100% by faith,
Mm-hmm.
not of ourselves. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but then, as Paul goes on in Ephesians chapter 2, we are his workmanship, his
Mm-hmm.
poema,
Mm-hmm.
where his poem, right? That
Yeah.
we're created
Beautiful.
to love like he loves, to do good things, to have a positive impact on others, or like to put it simply, just to be a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
you're shifting from that mindset then of, I have to do this in order to be right with God, from then going, because I am right with God, I get to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
externally, it can look very similar, but the
Yeah.
internal motivation has completely shifted. And the peace that comes with that, because you're like, I am right with God now. Therefore, I
Mm-hmm.
want to spend time with him. I am right with God. Therefore, I get to be this blessing. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, I can really relate to what you're sharing there.
Yeah. I
It's
think,
pretty radical.
yeah, I think though also, I'm not sure what particular type of uh Adventism, again speaking to our particular faith community, what type you've experienced there down under. But if it's anything like what I've experienced here in the US, and I'm not speaking really of my parents or my family, I'm speaking more broadly. Um, there's also, however, this extreme uh, fear of two things. Number one, being deceived. Like
Mm,
there's a huge emphasis on being deceived. So like, oh man, how do you know maybe you're being deceived and you're believing the wrong things and that sort of thing. And then number two, there's always, and I get this question all the time when I share the gospel, is boy, are you promoting some sort of like once saved, always saved? Does that
mm,
mean that what we do doesn't matter at all? And, you know, you can never throw away your salvation. And, I can appreciate and understand that concern, but I would say that anyone, if the gospel does not sound too good to be true. If the gospel does not sound in some ways, and I mean this in the broadest sense of the term, unbelievable,
mm,
then I'm not sure you've fully encountered the gospel. And, I've been uh, reminded of this recently in just some of my interactions, kind of in my local ministry, um, that, Paul was extremely jealous for the gospel. And,
mm,
he basically said, if you're bringing anything other than the gospel, you should be accursed. And he writes a whole letter, the book of Galatians is a whole letter basically saying, you guys are being, talk about deception. You're being
mm,
deceived away from the gospel. And even if an angel from God comes and brings you another gospel, quote unquote, it's like that person should be accursed, just
mm,
like so he was so jealous for the gospel. And I think kind of like what you're saying, human beings are so predisposed to earning our own way, to hustling, to self-righteousness, to trying to do it ourselves. It's almost like, we need to, like I say, we never graduate from the gospel. Like it's not
Mm,
like, okay, I figured that out. Yep, got that. Now let's get to the real important matters. It's like, no, no, no.
mm,
This is it. Like there's nothing beyond and apart from the gospel that matters. There's lots of stuff that matter, but they can only be presented and appreciated in the context of the gospel. So we can bring anything else, but if it's disconnected from the gospel, it's worthless. Like Paul in Philippians says everything else is just rubbish compared to,
mm,
knowing Jesus. So anyway, I hear what you're saying and I agree with you that there's this there's this fear for many reasons that, well, wait a minute. And I've had these conversations with a few people recently, like, whoa, 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 whoa. So what you're saying is what we do doesn't matter. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. It's just giving the proper context for what we
mm.
do. And it's placing the emphasis. I think it was Dallas Willard who said that the gospel is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning. Like
Mm.
we still participate in God's kingdom work, but we're not doing it out of a place of hustling. We're doing it out of
Yeah.
a place of gratitude and appreciation.
Mm. Yeah, it's that different motivation. I was smiling
Mhm.
before because I can relate to that idea of feeling like you've graduated from the gospel. Uh, and I remember like feeling like, oh yeah, I've grasped that and I want to move on to different topics now. And then even in my approach as a Bible worker, doing Bible studies with people, you do one or two studies on the gospel and then you move on. And like, all right, we've done
Yeah,
that, tick that box. And I shake my head at myself now. But that was my mindset. It's like, all right, you get this part,
mm,
move on. And maybe that was part of that's tying into that idea, that fear of being deceived.
mm,
So
hmm,
how do you navigate that? Because that's such a big part of Adventist culture. I've encountered that
yeah,
here in Australia as well. Because it's,
it
you
is.
think of um, in the Gospel of Matthew, see that you are not deceived, and Jesus
Yeah,
repeats this, and so it's really embedded in our DNA as Adventists that make sure you're not deceived. And so
yeah,
there's almost so much focus on that in itself could become a deception, right? Your emphasis on
yeah,
avoiding deception.
yeah, 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 for sure. It's we had just in the last 2 days. This is relevant. I don't know when you'll be sharing this, releasing this, but we've had a little bit of a hubbub here in my area, in my territory, with some controversial speakers that were sharing some things, and they were quite what I would call right wing and fundamentalist. And of course, one of the big messages that comes out in that type of kind of posture is again deception, deception, deception. Don't be deceived. All these people are deceived. And to me, what's really tragic is, and maybe the greatest deception of all, is those of us, and I know I can be in this category, who believe the everyone else is deceived, but
Mm,
yourself. And like warning against deception in a way that seemingly to me comes across as themselves being deceived. And so, yeah, I would say for me, what my observation is, being or not being deceived is maybe more about the posture of the heart
mm,
than the the capacities of the intellect, maybe if I could put it that way. Um, we could kind of go down this rabbit hole, but I won't try to go down it for very long. But in like the Hebrew Bible, what we often call the Old Testament, um, we the word for truth, oftentimes in our modern Western enlightened way of understanding truth, it's a propositional idea. It's a set of facts that are either propositionally true or not true. But in the scriptural way of understanding truth and, conversely, deception, um, truth in Hebrew is actually the word could be translated like steadfastness or reliability or trustworthiness.
Mm,
And so it has more to do with a level of integrity and confidence and reliability than like, okay, is this intellectually true? So the reason I bring that up is because again, it seems to have less to do with the kind of modern enlightenment way of defining truth as some intellectual correctness and has as much to do with being a person of integrity and trustworthiness. And so
mm,
is the posture of my heart one of humility and one of um, genuine openness and a desire to you know follow Revelation 14. I love one of my friends recently brought this to my attention. The definition of an Adventist is somebody who follows the Lamb wherever he goes. Do I
mm,
have that willingness? And that may or may not always be an intellectual exercise. In some ways, it might be just as much an embodied experience where I'm being a person of the truth when I'm
mm,
willing to go and serve these people. I'm being a person of the truth when I'm willing to allow my life to be exposed and I share vulnerably from my experience. So are we, I think going back to what we were talking about before, kind of securing ourselves against deception is as much to do with us being willing to be honest about ourselves, being honest about where we are.
mm,
And yeah, I think the intellectual propositional ideas are important. It's not less than that, but it's so much more than that.
mm,
And so I think, when it all comes down to it, um, you know, being or not being deceived will be based as much upon whether I have been if I have grown emotionally, relationally, socially, as much as whether I have the intellectual information correct. Because I think there's going to be a lot of people who have access to and have subscribed to the right intellectual information, but who nevertheless will be deceived in the end, if I could put it in those terms, not because, again, they knew the right information, but it's because they did
mm.
not allow their hearts to be shaped by the love and the humility of God and to be healed by his grace, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
yeah, it does. And it reminds me of something I heard Ty Gibson say once that God engages the intellect so he can get to our hearts. And like the
Mm,
whole the whole point of us, reasoning and trying to grasp these concepts is so it can penetrate into
hmm
the relational aspect. So if it's not going to that point, we've missed it. Uh, and I've
beautiful.
never
Absolutely.
thought of it through that lens in terms of yeah, looking through, trying to think how you worded it, truth compared to like a propositional, this Western mindset,
Mm,
and thinking through a
hmm
Hebrew mind of truth being integrity, and it's just being
hmm
that reliability, that faithfulness. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to do some
Yeah.
more thinking about that, which
Yeah.
I think that'd be a good segue because before you mentioned that what led you to start to grasp the gospel in a deeper way was this approach to becoming incarnational.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you the question: what is church? Because I think it
hmm
naturally flows on from when we've grasped what the gospel is. And God has established the church of people who are believing the gospel, right? So what is church?
hmm Yeah. So I would say on the most basic level, again, this is from my perspective, my conviction. Um, Church is God's people who are seeking to live out the ways of God in everyday life together.
Mm.
So it's fundamentally a community of people who have been transformed by the gospel and are seeking to live together in an authentic, open way and to live out the reality of God's good news together among, among the world around us.
Sounds like a hippie commune.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure for many people that's um a bit maybe intimidating or creepy or strange or like, yeah, hippie-ish.
Mm.
And they're saying, man, I prefer it to just be this clean, I show up once a week to this event or this program, and then
Mm.
I can opt out the rest of the week.
Mm.
And maybe if I have a social need or two to get my cup filled a little bit, I can get together with somebody midweek for something or go to a prayer meeting or whatever. And I'm not saying it has to be something different than that, but it has to be, I would say it's more than that.
Mm.
Um, it can include showing up to go to an event together once a week, but um, you know, I believe fundamentally the gospel is relational, and I
Mm.
just believe that what God is trying to do ultimately is to restore relationships. He's trying to restore relationship with himself. He's trying to restore relationship with each other. And so when we grasp that that is the whole goal of creation to begin with, that's the whole goal of redemption,
Mm.
why wouldn't we like just flock to that reality now? Like, so it's fundamentally an organic fellowship of Jesus followers who are trying to grow in Christ likeness together and trying to invite others into that beauty and that
Mm.
that beautiful and messy, experience of God's fellowship.
Mm. Yeah, that's something that I've recognized myself, the importance of going on a journey with people. For myself and others, I think to more fully grasp the gospel.
Hmm.
And there's that statement that you share in the book, which I quote it all the time. It's one of my favorite statements, that the path to healing and wholeness has to go through the garden of non-condemning love.
Mm,
It's just
mm,
such a powerful idea, and I think that almost encapsulates the gospel in and of itself. Uh,
mm,
and that people, I guess it's interesting thinking back to the first question I asked you, what is the gospel? And I think for many of us, we have to experience it before we'll understand it.
mm, hmm
And
hmm
maybe more
Yep.
so for those who have grown up in the church, because we've got this
Hmm.
intellectual knowledge, and that
Hmm.
almost creates um, I guess that familiarity breeds contempt, right? That we're like, oh yeah, yeah,
Mm,
the gospel, I get that,
yeah.
and then we we don't think any more about it, or we fail to grasp the depth of it. And
Hmm.
it's through relationships and seeing the transformative nature of that I've actually started to grasp the gospel with greater clarity myself, and experiencing that
Mm,
non-condemning love from God, and
hmm.
recognizing that's what he calls us to then extend to others, so they can experience the gospel before they've even necessarily heard of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Josh. And I appreciate you pointing it out because I think that was an important part of an ingredient in my own deepening understanding of an appreciation for the gospel is seeing that, like you say, embodied in the people of God. And it wasn't perfect, and it probably never will be perfect.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, like I do, bring out numerous times in the book, um, we have to embody these things. And people, we're as I talk about, we're open looped systems. So we need other people in order for these things to penetrate our inner being. And I used to have a church member, an older church member in my church that I've recently moved from. And he used to talk about his love for the gospel. And he says, you know, and I know this, lots of people say this, but he's like, I know a lot of people in this congregation, they have the gospel up here in their head, but the longest journey is the journey, 12 inches from the head to the heart. And to him, he just couldn't figure out why it failed to move from the head to the heart for people. And through this journey that that we've experienced the last few years, it did kind of click with me that the reason it doesn't
Mm,
for so many people is because, as you say, they have not experienced it in the people of God. So I can tell somebody all I want that God loves you, that he doesn't condemn you. But if I'm not embodying that towards you, it is not going to move from the head to the heart because there will be a cognitive dissonance and there will be a disconnect between what God's people are saying and what God's people are doing. And,
mm,
as we often say, actions speak louder than words. So, and I would just maybe put a plug in here for being in some form of like therapeutic relationship because I think there's a lot of emotional blockage that takes place as
mm,
well that are we many times we have a very low ceiling of our ability to really have God's love penetrate our hearts because there's all of this emotional baggage and blockage that we have not processed and the wounds and the traumas and all of that that we've not come face to face with, and we haven't done that mostly because it hasn't been safe to because we haven't been in places that are safe to process it. And
mm.
so being in some sort of therapeutic relationship, again, whether that's a licensed therapist or, that's what I would recommend. But if at the very least, being in communities that do have that sort of safe environment so that we can
Mm.
process the experiences of trauma that we've all experienced. Um, until we do that, I think the gospel still will have a hard time penetrating because there'll be walls that we've put up. We don't even realize we have those walls, and
Mm.
the gospel will never be able to penetrate beyond those walls because it just builds up this armor that can't be penetrated.
Yeah, which is it's the natural defense mechanism when we've been hurt,
Hmm.
right? That we put up those
Yep.
guards to prevent it happening again. But
Hmm.
I don't know if you've ever read the book Scary Close by Donald Miller.
I haven't, but I appreciate Donald Miller, but I've not read that one.
Yeah, that book had a huge impact on me because I would have been an individual that didn't realize I had these walls in place and
Mm,
would have moments where I was wondering why didn't have a deeper encounter with God and with people, but didn't make a connection that had actually put up these walls. And he shares his experience of seeking deeper intimacy with people, and he shares a story from he went to I guess like a therapy camp for adults is the way he describes it. And he's sitting down with one of the therapists one day, and the guy mentioned that we're all born like a perfect self, and so he draws a circle on the page, and then he says, at some point we encounter either something we do, something someone does to us, but we encounter shame, and so then he
mm,
draws a circle of shame around the self, and then because of that shame, he says we then seek to cover it up, and so then he drew a third circle around, and we cover the shame because we think that makes us unlovable, and so then we go
mm,
around in our costumes. But he says,
mm,
as long as we're wearing a costume, it prevents us from actually having true connection with people because they're not connecting with us; they're connecting with the costume. But
mm,
we don't take the costume off because we fear people saw our shame, they would reject us, and we
mhm,
think the shame makes us unlovable. And I guess the power of the gospel is that we are fully known by God and yet fully loved. So he
mhm,
knows our shame, and whether it was things that we did or things that were done to us, he looks beyond that and sees that we're still lovable and doesn't reject
mm,
us,
mm,
which is
mm,
I think it's the antidote to that problem. is to recognize that you are fully known, fully loved. And then we can take that costume off. We let God deal with the shame, which ultimately is on the cross, right? It's put to death there.
Mm,
And
mm,
then we can start expressing and living as our true selves. Like we encounter this healing
mhm,
and live as we were
mhm,
always called and designed to be. And then we can then go about as individuals who then liberate others from their shame by showing them that non-condemning love. And if you have a community of people
mhm,
doing that,
mhm,
and I love this idea I got from Marcus Torres in his book Hidden,
mm,
where he talks
mhm,
about how we're called to be living temples. And when you look at the whole sanctuary concept, it reveals God's heart is to be with his people. He's this relational God dwelling in the midst of Israel. And then if we're going to be the living temple, God dwelling within us, it's that same desire. God wants to be his people. But what has now happened is the temple isn't located to a geographical location. It's on the move. It's
mhm,
transportable, and you've got all these individuals that are living temples. So then God can be present with all these different people who aren't going to come to a physical building. Rather, God goes
mhm,
to them, which has always been his
mhm,
desire. And then we get to be a
mhm,
part of that and liberate people through relationship. And I think that's what I'm coming to see with greater clarity is the power of the
mm,
gospel and what the church is called to be.
mhm. That is beautiful, man. I want to look up that um Donald Miller book. You said what's it called?
Scary close.
Scary Close. All
Scary
right, I'm
close.
going to check that one out because that's powerful. And I appreciate Marcus's book as well, having read it. I think, man, if and I suppose some people could claim that I'm just kind of like a bleeding heart and I'm overly in tuned with, kind of emotional versions of Christianity or religion. But I think, man, if the church could truly be what you've just described, where we are embodying that non-condemning love and giving people space to grow and to heal and to be exposed and open and vulnerable,
Mm,
and we could provide that acceptance and that love, man, I think the whole world, the world could be changed. It could be turned upside down because I mean, again, I know there's plenty of people who say, well, that's not what we're really about. We're about preaching this message or eating this food. And I'm not saying we're not about those things as well, but if that if that's not the heart and if everything does
mm,
not flow out of that and actually lead back to that, then what are we doing?
mm,
And I think all of these things are, again, at the most fundamental level, the gospel, which includes the task that I believe, you know, we've been called to when it comes to, these different truths that or parts of the story, I'll put it that way, that, you know, our particular faith community has understood. Um, at the most fundamental level, it is about seeking to restore broken relationships.
mm,
And and if we're not remembering that that's what it's all supposed to stem from and lead to both, as I've articulated, the fundamental reality of God is that of community, right? Like Father, Son, and Spirit, Holy Spirit. And we were created by community and for community,
mm,
right? We were saved by community and for community. And if we lose sight of that fact, man, again, I don't know why we exist. And if we were to somehow reach that vision and live it out, boy, this whole world could be turned upside down, I think.
mm. Yeah, I see that potential as well, and that's the message of the kingdom of God, right?
Yep,
Mm.
yep,
But
absolutely. And yeah.
no, you go.
Go. No, I was gonna say again that study of what is the New Testament, you know, explanation of the gospel, when I did come across that the gospel of the kingdom, it's like, oh, there's something much bigger here than it is incredibly important. Everything stands on the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross and our justification by faith. That's the foundation. The
mm,
gospel, to me, encapsulates more than that. It's not less than that, but it is more than that. And that is the
mm.
gospel of the kingdom, God seeking to restore his kingdom of love, which very much includes and is focused on restoring and healing, broken, damaged relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say like that common comment that as a people we're raised up to to preach the three angels' messages. But
Mm-hmm.
when you think about what the message is, right, the first angel comes proclaiming the everlasting gospel, which is what we've been
Mm-hmm.
talking about, and then you
Mm-hmm.
have the second angel saying Babylon is fallen, which is a
Mm-hmm.
system that is perpetuating lies. Which so you're
Mm-hmm.
calling people out of a system that's continuing to enslave and calling them into the truth of the gospel, which once again
Mm-hmm.
what we've been talking about. So people experiencing that non-condemning love of God, learning how to function as they're designed, and then loving others in the same way so that they can be liberated. And it's
Mm-hmm.
it's moving out of the world's way or Babylon's way of thinking, feeling, behaving into God's way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. That's
Mm-hmm.
what that second message is.
Yeah.
And then you got the third, that if we're remaining in that system, then you end up suffering with it. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's
Mm-hmm.
that's the message of righteousness by faith, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what we've
Mm-hmm.
been talking about is the three angels' messages, and yet there's that disconnect, I think, for some individuals where they go, I don't think they see the connection, and maybe it's because they haven't, maybe the gospel hasn't shifted from here to here, or they haven't grasped the
Yeah.
enormity or like the whole picture there. But yeah, it kind of,
Yeah. I feel like, unfortunately, what's happened so often and so much is that, that message, the three angels' messages, um, is often approached very reductionistically.
mm,
Like it's very focused on, and I'm not saying it doesn't include this, but it's like Babylon is fallen because they go to church on the wrong day of the week.
mm,
And like, or they believe that when you die, you go to heaven. Again, I think these ideas are unbiblical, and yeah, I think it's important to point people to the biblical narrative that corrects those ideas. But going to church on the wrong day or right day is not the end goal, right?
mm,
The reason we we celebrate and we step into the reality of, say, Sabbath is again to restore relationship,
mm,
to connect us to God, to connect us with each other. And some might say, well, you know, uh, I guess it doesn't matter what day then, because you can be in a relationship with your fellow man on any day of the week. And not to go too far down this path, but um, I was I was with some of my friends in a book club a few years ago, and we all were talking about how it would be great if all of us, and we're all from different religious backgrounds, how if all of us could just kind of, what if we had a weekly day of the week, one day a week where we could kind of all just have the day off and hang out with each other. And, we suddenly realized, well, somebody has a Sunday, somebody does a Saturday, someone does a Friday. And it was just kind of like, again, a moment of clarity for me. I said, man, it's so hard to get on the same schedule as everybody else. I
mm,
said, wouldn't it be nice if we just all had the same day? And I was like, well, how would we figure out what day it was? How could we come to any agreement on that? And I was like, well, I guess we could just follow what scripture teaches, So it's like if it's all up to each individual, then like it would be really hard to get
mm,
into a relational rhythm with each other.
yeah,
Um, Now, that argument will be made by no doubt many people and say, well, just make it Sunday then. And I'm not going to condemn anyone if that's what they come to, but like, why not just keep it simple and do the thing that Jesus already did? So
mm,
anyway, that's how it was kind of like a moment of clarity where I said, oh, this is kind of one of the benefits of having that day, relationally, where we
mm.
can all kind of get into those same rhythm together. Um, but I'm
Yeah,
sure
because
that,
those
Go
rhythms are
ahead.
so important, hey,
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
terms of shaping who we are, who we're becoming.
Yeah. Yeah. We just purchased a new home and our real estate agent um was a is a Christian, which is not very common in Maine. I know it's even less common in Australia, but you know, we talked to him a little bit about Sabbath, and not that we're like preaching at him, but we just, we're like, oh, we probably won't go look at a home on a Saturday or whatever. And he uh he just works nonstop. He just works nonstop. And so every once in a while, I would just throw in there like in a text to him, I was like, hey, Craig, like you could use the Sabbath. And he's like, oh yeah, yeah, I find time here and there or whatever. But I was
Mm,
just like, and this brother would absolutely benefit from a regular
mm.
rhythm of rest every week because when we put that in stone, it allows us to really get into that rhythm and all that. But anyway, I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, Josh.
Yeah, but it's such a valuable thing in our time, especially when people are so busy. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like I think, yeah, but putting faith aside for a moment, you just go like having that regular locked in time when you go, this is protected. This is when I'm going to have rest, time for relationships, time to connect and be recharged. I think that the
Mm-hmm.
world would benefit from that, right?
Yeah,
It's
and there's so many people who are talking about that more and
mm,
more. In fact, one of the presenters that I kind of alluded to before, he reeled off a bunch of new, articles from different publications that were pushing for a weekly rest. And, he was utilizing this as like a signs of the time, piece.
mm,
And I just thought to myself, instead of criticizing people who are saying we need a weekly rest, why don't we acknowledge that and say, you know what, that's awesome. You recognize it, you're
mm,
affirming it. Like, let me tell you about this awesome opportunity you could have. Not get, bogged down in the day. I do think obviously Saturday is
mm,
the scriptural, but like not criticize them for that, but acknowledge it and invite them into Sabbath rather
mm.
than
Yeah, you,
utilizing it
you
as
can
a sign of the
celebrate.
time. Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
I mean, I think that's a instead of being some sort of demonic uh, conspiracy that, hey, look at all these people are plotting this, you know,
mm,
Sunday worship. It's like, no, maybe this is the Spirit of God working on them, recognizing that they need to slow down
mm,
because they've been hustling too much and they haven't truly entered into the rest of the gospel. So let's just affirm it and say, oh, that's awesome that you recognize that.
mm.
Hey, here's a bridge into the beauty of this day that God gave us.
Yeah, which I guess it ties into what we mentioned before with that fear of deception, and then
Hmm.
something else you mentioned in your book that as you became more secure in your relationship with God, you were less concerned about being right, and
Hmm.
so that insecurity was removed, and so then you didn't have to be as defensive of your beliefs because you were secure in them because you're secure
Hmm.
in Christ. And I found that myself that in early days in my walk, if someone disagreed with me, it was almost like I feared my beliefs being proved wrong. And so I had to come to the defense. And so
Hmm.
there wasn't really a sense of rest or peace in that. And as I've grown in my understanding and deepened that relationship with God, which has come from seeing more clearly the accomplished fact as that solid foundation, that's giving me a sense of peace where if someone disagrees with me, I can just seek to understand now rather than seeking to defend my cause because like it doesn't impact
Hmm.
me. Like I'm
Hmm.
secure in who I know myself to be, who I know God to be, what I know the accomplished fact to be in terms of
Hmm.
the gospel. And so then I can put my agenda on the side and just go, okay, let me understand you. And I love that rule from Stephen Covey, seek first to understand before you seek to be understood. And I see this
Hmm.
in Christ's method, right? That he
Hmm.
he, he mingled with men desiring their good. He sympathized with them, which I think a modern word would be empathize with them. He sought to understand. He then met their
Yeah.
needs, won their
Yeah.
confidence, and then he says, "Follow me." But he put people first. Like he genuinely liked them. He was
Mm-hmm.
understanding them. He met their needs. Then the trust was built, and then he's like, "Hey, follow me."
Mm-hmm.
Whereas so often we jump straight to the "I'm right, you're wrong. This is why," and there's no relationship there. And maybe you win the
Yeah.
argument, and you feel justified that your belief is correct, but
Mm-hmm.
you've had no positive impact. And I think it's actually stemming from insecurity within your own relationship with God. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's interesting just thinking about that in relation to people discovering the need for rest.
Yeah, Josh, what you've described is it's just yeah, water to my soul. It's like it's beautiful. I mean, you know, I obviously come into these convictions myself, but again, needing to be reminded of them.
Mm,
And I think that's one of the reasons why we need each other is because we do need to be gospeled by each other regularly. Um, and yeah, that was such a pivotal moment for me. And I can't point to any one moment that it kind of sunk in with me, but just again, because of kind of the air that I breathed my whole life being a Seventh-day Adventist, this preoccupation with being right
mm,
and believing that in many ways our salvation is dependent on us believing the right information, our security against like last day deception is dependent on me believing the right information. It was like a heavy burden was lifted from my shoulders where I was like, oh man, that's just not true. Like
mm,
my salvation, my security, my well-being, my healing, my growth is dependent on Jesus. It's not
mm,
dependent on my ability to believe the right information. It's not dependent on my theology. I mean, this is a classic Protestant recognition that justification is by faith alone, right? So, like, where do we ever get this idea that justification is by believing the right information? And
mm,
when you step into that, it's just so freeing and liberating. And I know to some degree, and for some people, it sounds scary, but I don't know if the gospel isn't a little scary. I don't know if it's the gospel, right? Like
mm,
it's supposed to nudge us into this absolute unbelievable, recognition. So yeah, man, it's hard to explain sometimes to people who don't like who aren't there because again, it's like all of the defense mechanisms, theological defense mechanisms pop up. It's like, oh, but.
mm,
It reminds me, by the way, of a sermon that Ty Gibson preached one time where he talked about his friend who had a big fat butt. And I don't know if you've heard it at all, but he would always respond by saying, but.
mm.
I know that God loves
Yeah,
me, but dot dot dot. I know that salvation is by grace through faith, but it's just like we just gotta get rid of the but. Just get rid
yeah,
of the
yeah.
but. No, nobody, I would submit, nobody who has truly gone all in with Jesus, gone all in with the gospel, has ever gone off the rails.
Mm,
I mean, I'm being a little exaggerating, but I would say to whatever degree they went off the rails, it was not because of the gospel, it was in spite of it.
yeah. I like what you said before, Shawn, that we really need to get together, have these conversations, and gospel each other. You say
Mm,
gospel each other. I call it practicing gospel, and that's what
there
this
you go.
podcast is all about: is having these
Mm,
conversations where we're just speaking that truth over one another and helping ourselves and others who are listening to deepen our understanding of of what gospel is and how it benefits us and what that should then naturally lead to as the outflow of encountering it. But
mm,
yeah, I just want to thank you for making the time to come and chat. And yeah, this has been a real
Yeah,
pleasure. So thank you for coming.
Josh, Josh, it was my pleasure, and it was greatly encouraging to me. So thanks for having me, and hopefully we'll meet you in person soon.